What if I told you that one of the greatest voices for peace once nearly beat a man to death at a party? It wasn't some nameless rock star in a bar fight. It was John Lennon, yes. That John Lennon. The dreamer. The Beatle. The man who asked us to imagine all the people living life in peace. But behind that iconic message, behind the wire-rimmed glasses and soft voice, lived a man who carried storms within him. Not metaphors. Real. Violent. Scarring storms. And for a moment, just one moment, he almost lost himself completely to that darkness. At Paul McCartney's 21st birthday party. No less. Now let me ask you, how far can we stretch our forgiveness for a genius before we begin rewriting morality itself? Is greatness a get-out-of-jail-free card? Or have we spent decades romanticizing trauma because it fits our myth? Welcome to Tragedy Uncovered. This is not a tribute. This is not a takedown. This is an attempt to hold the mirror still so we can finally look. If this kind of truth-seeking resonates with you, make sure to subscribe and click the bell. We dig where others glance. John Lennon's story isn't just one of fame. It's the story of a man who was abandoned before he could spell the word. His father, a merchant seaman, disappeared when Lennon was just a toddler. When he did return, it wasn't to reclaim fatherhood. It was to steal his son. Literally. He tried to kidnap young John and flee to New Zealand. It didn't work. But the damage? It was done. Julia, Lennon's mother, wasn't equipped to raise him alone. Charming but unstable, she handed custody over to her sister, Mimi, a stern, proper woman who ran a quiet house. A safe house, but not necessarily a warm one. Julia would visit, not with bedtime stories, but with records, banjo lessons, laughter, and chaos. To John, she was part fantasy, part friend, part mother, never fully any one of them. When she died in a car accident at just 17, it wasn't simply a loss. It was a second abandonment. One Lennon would later say broke him in a way he never recovered from. Let's pause here. Picture a boy rejected by his father, raised by an aunt, emotionally entangled with a mother who disappears twice, once physically, once permanently. Now put that boy on a stage, hand him a guitar, and ask him to sing about love. That's not a backstory, it's a blueprint for implosion. But Lennon didn't just implode. He exploded through music, rebellion, rage. There's a quote often cited in psychology: what isn't transformed is transmitted. And John Lennon transmitted his trauma loudly. To women, to bandmates, to the people who loved him. There are well-documented incidents where Lennon struck his first wife, Cynthia. He once admitted that in a moment of drunken jealousy, he hit her so hard that her head slammed against the wall. That wasn't just a lover's quarrel. That was a man who had learned to use pain as a language when words failed him. Still want to idolize him? That's not a rhetorical jab. It's a genuine question we should be asking ourselves more often. Not because Lennon wasn't brilliant, was. Not because he didn't evolve, he did. But because in making gods out of men, we lose the human context. The pain. The cautionary tale. We flatten nuance into legend. Let's go deeper. Lennon's friendship with fellow Beatle Stuart Sutcliffe was intense, complex, and by some accounts, deeply intimate. In public, Lennon mocked him, tormented him. But in private, Stuart wrote him long, emotionally loaded letters. Lennon's sister claimed they were more than friends. And when Stuart died suddenly from a brain hemorrhage, a dark rumor followed that a fight with Lennon where he allegedly kicked Stuart in the head may have contributed to his death. Lennon reportedly confessed years later, full of guilt, "I was wearing pointy cowboy boots that night." Now, whether or not he caused Stuart's death, the gravity of that admission cannot be ignored. What kind of emotional storm must you carry to lash out that way? And how does a man live with that afterward? This isn't just about Lennon's darker instincts. It's about how easily we excuse them when they belong to people we adore. Because make no mistake, if an average man had admitted to some of the things Lennon did, the public would demand accountability. But Lennon? We wrote it off as tormented genius, as if that excused everything. And perhaps that's what makes this story so troubling. Lennon did fight for peace. He did inspire generations. But in his personal life, he was often at war with himself, with those closest to him. And instead of confronting that, we polished the narrative until it gleamed. So what happens when the myth meets the mirror? That's what we'll keep uncovering, one uncomfortable truth at a time. Stay with us, because this story only gets deeper. In the next section, we'll examine Lennon's unraveling inside the Beatles, the fame, the drugs, the resentment, and the role that Yoko Ono played in accelerating everything. Was she the villain the media made her out to be? Or was she Lennon's mirror, reflecting the very chaos he refused to face? You decide. We just follow the cracks. If Lennon's early years carved the first cracks in his psyche, then his years with the Beatles widened them into fault lines. Fame didn't heal him. It magnified everything: his brilliance, his fragility, and, most dangerously, his volatility. The deeper he went into the rabbit hole of stardom, the harder it became to tell the difference between rebellion and self-destruction. By the early 1960s, the Beatles were exploding into global phenomenon status. The lovable mop-tops from Liverpool were more than just a band. They were a cultural revolution. But behind the scenes, Lennon was growing restless. The screaming fans, the rigid touring schedules, the smiling press appearance, it all began to feel hollow. He once admitted that concerts became meaningless, saying he couldn't hear the music over the sound of the crowd. It's hard to imagine the man who wrote Help didn't just mean it as a song title, but as an actual plea. Within the group, tensions simmered. Creative control, ego clashes, and personal insecurities swirled in the background of every studio session. But the real fracture started to form when John Lennon met Yoko Ono. Now, let's tread carefully here, because no figure in Beatles lore is more polarizing than Yoko. Some fans painted her as the villain who broke up the band. Others saw her as a scapegoat for a breakup that was already inevitable. The truth, as always, is messy. Yoko didn't create the cracks in the Beatles, she simply refused to ignore them. She became John's collaborator, his partner, his emotional mirror. And for a man who'd spent his life swinging between emotional detachment and neediness, that was a terrifying and irresistible combination. It wasn't long before Lennon violated the band's unspoken code: no girlfriends or wives in the studio. But Yoko wasn't just in the room. She was in the process, offering feedback, making suggestions, existing in a space the other Beatles believed sacred. It wasn't just her presence. It was what her presence represented. She was a symbol of Lennon's shift away from the group, away from consensus, and into a world that revolved around his own emotional needs. Paul McCartney once described it as watching John leave the room emotionally and not come back. That emotional departure was happening off-record too. In 1968, while Cynthia Lennon was away on a trip that John himself encouraged, she returned to find her husband at home with Yoko, both in bathrobes. John's response: a casual, "Oh, hi." That wasn't just betrayal, it was abandonment. And it mirrored the very wound that defined Lennon's own childhood. The unraveling continued. During the infamous White Album sessions, tensions between bandmates were so thick they could barely finish songs without erupting into arguments. George Harrison grew increasingly bitter, watching his compositions get sidelined while Lennon and McCartney clashed like aging gladiators. Ringo Starr even temporarily quit the band at one point. But the worst fracture occurred between John and Georgia, a relationship once rooted in mutual admiration. George, the quiet Beatle, was deeply spiritual. He was diving into Eastern philosophy, growing as a songwriter, and yearning for inner peace. But Lennon, now inseparable from Yoko and deep into chemical experimentation, seemed less interested in harmony and more drawn to provocation. On the surface, they were still colleagues. Underneath, a Cold War was brewing. That war boiled over during the Let It Be sessions, all captured on camera. There's a moment, subtle yet devastating, where Harrison visibly withdraws his frustration thinly veiled behind his calm demeanor. Reportedly, there was even a physical altercation just off camera. George later admitted, "It was a very tense time. I walked out thinking, I'm not doing this anymore." Lennon, ever the provocateur, threatened to replace him with Eric Clapton. Why does this matter? Because we often talk about the Beatles' breakup as a clean cut, a band that simply outgrew itself. But in truth, it was more like a marriage collapsing under the weight of personal trauma, miscommunication, and competing wounds. Lennon wasn't just breaking from the band. He was trying to reclaim control over a life that had always fell out of his hands. And then came the bed-in. For their honeymoon, Lennon and Yoko staged a week-long protest for peace from the bed of an Amsterdam hotel. Photographers and journalists were invited daily. Lennon called it a commercial for peace. But for many watching, it felt tone-deaf. Here was a man who had physically hurt his wife, emotionally neglected his son, and alienated his closest friends, now preaching love and peace from silk sheets. Was it hypocrisy? Maybe. Was it performance art? Absolutely. But perhaps more than anything, it was desperation. Lennon wasn't just trying to change the world. He was trying to rewrite his own narrative, to show the world a new version of himself, one that could love openly, feel deeply, and advocate loudly. The problem? He hadn't fully reckoned with the wreckage he'd left behind. That wreckage became even more apparent in 1969. Lennon, increasingly erratic, decided to take a road trip to the Scottish Highlands with Yoko, her daughter, and his son Julian. The problem? John was a notoriously bad driver. He crashed the car. Everyone survived, but Yoko suffered a back injury, and Lennon had to get stitches. Still, the press spun it into a quaint family getaway gone wrong. What they didn't see was the emotional toll. Julian, Lennon's firstborn, once again found himself in the periphery just as John had once been. History, as they say, was repeating itself. Lennon's instability bled into the music. He had a king-size bed delivered to the studio so Yoko could lie down beside him during recording sessions. This wasn't just eccentricity, it was a declaration. "This is who I am now," he seemed to say. "Accept it or leave." Eventually, they all left. The Beatles disbanded officially in 1970. And with that, Lennon was finally free from compromise, from constraint, from the group that made him famous. But freedom has a cost. For Lennon, that cost was isolation. He'd spent a lifetime trying to be heard, trying to be loved, trying to escape the shadows of rejection and abandonment. But in pushing everyone away, he risked becoming the very thing he feared most, alone. In the next part, we'll dive into the chaotic chapter known as Lennon's Lost Weekend. It's the part of his life that looked like indulgence on the outside, but might have been his last attempt to reconnect with the people he'd once pushed away. Because even rebels get tired of running. And sometimes, the hardest thing to do is to come home. Picking up from where we left off, John Lennon was finally free. Free from the Beatles. Free from the pressure to smile through studio fights and write hits for a world that rarely asked how he felt. But freedom, for Lennon, didn't look like peace. It looked like chaos with a drink in one hand, regret in the other, and a trail of broken connections stretching behind him. This brings us to what would later be dubbed his Lost Weekend, a surreal 18-month chapter in his life. starting in 1973. Except it wasn't a weekend. And it wasn't exactly lost. It was orchestrated by the very woman people blamed for his prior unraveling Yoko Ono. At that point, the tension between them had reached a boiling point. Fans hated her. The media hounded them. And John, volatile and prone to escape, was spiraling again. So in a move that still baffles historians and biographers alike, Yoko gave him permission now. Encouragement to leave. And not just leave, but leave with someone. That someone was May Pang, their personal assistant. Yoko arranged the separation like it was a business transaction. She told May, in so many words, take care of him. He needs a break. If that sounds strange, that's because it was. But May Pang wasn't just a bystander. She was kind, grounded, and surprisingly stabilizing for John. Their relationship wasn't just romantic. It was redemptive. For the first time in years, John began reconnecting with pieces of his life he'd long abandoned, starting with his son Julian. It's easy to forget that Julian had barely known his father. During the height of Beatlemania, Lennon had distanced himself from both Cynthia and Julian. Even after the divorce, he remained mostly absent. But during this lost weekend, John invited Julian to spend time with him in Los Angeles. And for a moment, father and son had the beginnings of a real bond. They swam, played guitar, laughed. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. Lennon also began repairing his friendship with Paul McCartney. The two had gone through years of tension, fueled by legal battles, artistic rivalry, and deeply personal jabs through song lyrics. But during this period, they reconnected first over the phone, then in person. There's even a legendary, though poorly recorded, jam session between John, Paul, Stevie Wonder, and others. It was chaotic and musically underwhelming, but symbolically, it was monumental. The ice was thawing. Unfortunately, the calm didn't last. While Lennon was rebuilding bonds, he was also diving headfirst into destructive behavior. His time in L.A. became a circus of drunken outbursts, public humiliation, and near arrests. Stories from this era are infamous. He was thrown out of clubs. He heckled performers. He once got into a scuffle at the Troubadour wearing a sanitary napkin on his head as a joke. These weren't just rock star antics. They were warning signs. Here was a man desperately trying to outrun his own pain and doing it publicly. And the public, as it often does, laughed along. No one asked the deeper questions. No one paused to wonder if Lennon was okay. After all, wasn't he always a little unpredictable? A little volatile? But behind the headlines, there was a man cracking at the seams. He'd told interviewers that he felt creatively stuck. He'd confided in friends that fame felt like a prison. And despite being surrounded by people, he couldn't shake the feeling of being profoundly alone. Yoko, meanwhile, never let go completely. She stayed in touch with May Pang, often calling to check in on John, sometimes several times a day. She even began seeing someone else, a man she called her bodyguard. But her hold on Lennon was psychological, not physical. When she eventually called John back to New York, he didn't hesitate. He packed his bags, said goodbye to May Pang, and returned to Yoko's orbit. Shortly after, she was pregnant with their son, Sean. What followed was perhaps the most unexpected transformation in John Lennon's life. He walked away from music, from public life, from the chaos, and became, by all accounts, a full-time father. For 5 years, he stayed out of the spotlight. He baked bread. He changed diapers. He read bedtime stories. He tried really to be the parent he never had. But even that chapter wasn't without shadows. Those close to Lennon say that, beneath the quiet domesticity, the old demons still stirred. George Harrison once visited during this period and described John as a man who wanted to say something but couldn't. You could see it in his eyes. George recalled. He was silently crying out to reconnect. But something held him back. Was it fear? Pride? Shame? Whatever it was. It kept John isolated artistically and emotionally. He was no longer writing. No longer speaking out. The voice that had once defined a generation had gone quiet. And perhaps, in that quiet, he was finally listening to himself. But the world wasn't done with him yet. In 1980, after 5 years of silence, John Lennon returned to the studio. He recorded Double Fantasy with Yoko, a record filled with optimism, playfulness, and a sense of renewal. Critics were skeptical. Fans were hopeful. And John, for the first time in decades, seemed genuinely happy. It was a comeback, not just to music but to himself. And then, just like that, it ended. Only a few weeks after the album's release, Lennon was approached outside his home at the Dakota by a fan named Mark David Chapman. He signed an album for him. Hours later, that same man returned with a gun. Lennon was shot 4 times in the back and shoulder. He was rushed to the hospital but pronounced dead on arrival. He was 40 years old. Just like that. The story closed, but the questions didn't. Why did a man who spent his life chasing peace so often create chaos? Was he a product of trauma? Or an architect of destruction? Did the world fail John Lennon by praising the myth while ignoring the man? Or did he fail himself by refusing to reckon with the weight of his contradictions? In the next part, we'll return to one of the most disturbing flashpoints in his life, the DJ beating at Paul McCartney's birthday. It wasn't just a drunken fight, it was a moment of near homicidal rage. And it left a man physically and emotionally scarred. What drove Lennon to the edge? And why did the world so quickly forgive him? Because sometimes, the most shocking part of a tragedy isn't the act itself. It's how easily we look away. As we step back into the darker folds of John Lennon's life, we return to a night that's often skimmed over in Beatles folklore, but it shouldn't be. Paul McCartney's 21st birthday party. What should have been a joyful, music-filled gathering among friends turned into something far more disturbing. It was a night when Lennon's internal chaos bled into public violence so brutal, it left one man permanently changed. The party was held in Liverpool, 1963. The Beatles were ascending rapidly, riding the wave of Beatlemania before it even had a name. Friends, family, music industry insiders, and journalists gathered. Among them was Bob Wooler, a well-known DJ and close associate of the band, someone who championed their early days. But in a moment of casual, just a joke about Lennon's recent trip to Spain, something inside John snapped. Fueled by alcohol, resentment, and perhaps years of buried shame, Lennon flew into a blind rage. He attacked Wooler with a stick, beating him until he bled, until he screamed, until others had to pull Lennon off him. According to Lennon's own later admission, "It was the first time I thought I could kill someone. I saw it happening like on a movie screen, one more hit, and he would have been gone." This wasn't a barroom scuffle. This was an attempted beating so severe, it could have ended in manslaughter. And yet, no charges were filed. No scandalous headlines erupted. No career damage followed. Instead, Wooler disappeared from the spotlight, and Lennon went on to become one of the most revered artists in modern history. Which raises a difficult question. Why? Why do some men walk away from brutal behavior with their halos still intact, while others are crucified for far less? Was it the charm? The fame? The music? Or was society, the press, the fans already bought so deeply into the Lennon myth that we couldn't bear to interrupt it with truth? There's a pattern here, and it matters. Throughout his life, Lennon projected both revolutionary ideals and personal demons. He preached peace while enacting rage. He wrote lyrics about love while emotionally abandoning or harming those closest to him. And we accepted it. Not just accepted or celebrated it. We turned him into a paradox we were too afraid to question. Take his advocacy for peace, the bed-ins, the anti-war interviews, the U.S. government surveillance. Lennon became the face of a movement. And yet, behind closed doors, he was often battling his own violent tendencies, not just against others but against himself. Substance abuse, depression, verbal outbursts. These weren't hidden footnotes, they were recurring features of his personal narrative. But when it came to the media, most of it was softened, sanitized, even romanticized. It's worth asking, would the public have forgiven Lennon so easily if he'd lived in today's world? In an age where cancel culture, accountability, and online outrage are instantaneous, would he have been given the same second, third, fourth chances? Or would we have dissected every mistake, every confession, every contradiction? And then there's Cynthia. After the incident with Bob Wooler, Lennon promised he would never lose control like that again. But his marriage to Cynthia had already suffered emotional and physical blows. She spoke years later of an environment where she felt ignored, dismissed, and at times afraid. Lennon's jealousy could flare into anger within seconds. Once, after seeing her dance with a friend, he lashed out physically. It wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a display of power, a manifestation of trauma. And let's not forget how that marriage ended. Cynthia came home from a trip when John had strongly encouraged Ed to find her husband with Yoko Ono in their house, wearing robes as if nothing was amiss. When she confronted him, his response wasn't apologetic. It was indifferent. And when she tried to process what was happening, she was met not with reconciliation, but with legal threats. He's going to divorce you, take your child, and send you back to Hoylake. One of Lennon's aides reportedly told her. Think about that. A man who abandoned his father, lost his mother, and spent years singing about love threatened to take away his own child and exile his wife in the same breath. What does that say? This isn't character assassination. This is character examination. Because understanding the full picture of John Lennon doesn't diminish his genius, it contextualizes it. It forces us to reckon with how trauma can twist a person's sense of right and wrong, how brilliance and cruelty can occupy the same space, and how history often polishes its heroes until we no longer recognize them. And for all his contradictions, Lennon was aware. He once admitted in an interview, "I used to be cruel to my woman, and physically any woman. I was a hitter. I couldn't express myself, and I hit. I fought men and hit women." That confession wasn't an apology. It was an acknowledgement, a raw, unsettling truth that many chose to skim past. But maybe we shouldn't, because buried in that statement is something more important than an image. It's the realization that unchecked pain becomes inherited pain. Lennon didn't invent his violence. He absorbed it through abandonment, through rejection, through silence, and then, unable to metabolize it, he passed it on. To Cynthia, to Julian, to Bob Wooler, to himself. Which brings us back to the birthday party, a moment when years of pressure, unresolved trauma, and distorted ego exploded. It wasn't just a drunken mistake. It was a signal flare. A moment when the man behind the myth stepped into full view. Bloody, unfiltered, real, and we collectively chose to look away. In the next chapter, we'll explore Lennon's final years, his surprising transformation into a full-time father, the quiet battles he still fought behind closed doors, and the haunting sense that just as he was rediscovering himself, it was too late. Because for some legends, reinvention doesn't come with a second act. It comes with an unfinished sentence. Picking up from that brutal truth at McCartney's birthday party, we now enter what many consider John Lennon's quietest chapter, a time that seemed, on the surface, like peace. But silence doesn't always mean serenity. Sometimes, it just means the noise has gone inward. After years of creative clashes, media frenzy, and public unraveling, Lennon retreated, not into exile, but into domestic life. In 1975, when his second son Sean was born, Lennon made a decision that shocked both the music industry and his fans. He stepped away from it all. He chose to become, simply, a father, a full-time one. No tours, no albums, no interviews, just pancakes, lullabies, and long days spent at home in the Dakota building. To the outside world, this looked like redemption. After all the turbulence, abandoning Julian, betraying Cynthia, torching the Beatles from the inside, Lennon was finally getting it right. But the truth, as always with Lennon, was layered. The first thing to understand is this: Lennon's parenting of Sean was not just an act of love. It was also an act of compensation. He was painfully aware of how he'd failed Julian, his firstborn. In interviews, he referred to Julian as part of a different life, an era when he hadn't yet learned how to be present, or even willing. With Sean, he was determined to rewrite the script. But as noble as that intention was, it came with complications. Because while Sean got bedtime stories and daily affection, Julian got distance and awkward visits. While Sean had a father who baked bread and walked him to school, Julian grew up watching his dad from a magazine cover. The contrast was stark, and no matter how much Lennon tried to fix it on one end, the damage on the other end lingered. Julian himself would later describe his relationship with his father as distant and cold. He spoke candidly about how painful it was to see the world celebrate John as a great father when his own experience told a very different story. And that dissonance, that emotional gap between public image and personal reality, is at the heart of Lennon's legacy. Because here was a man who desperately wanted to love, but didn't always know how. He'd grown up bouncing between caregivers, absorbing love and strange, chaotic doses, too much charm from his mother, too much discipline from Aunt Mimi, too much silence from his father. And as a result, Lennon carried both neediness and avoidance in every relationship he entered. That same complexity extended into his marriage with Yoko Ono. Their bond was real, no doubt. It was creative, passionate, even symbiotic. But it was also controlling, insular, and at times emotionally manipulative on both sides. They weren't just lovers, they were each other's worlds. And that kind of closed-circuit intimacy, while intense, doesn't always leave room for healing. During his 5-year retirement, Lennon kept a low profile. He painted, he cooked, he cared for Sean, but beneath that domestic calm, the old restlessness hadn't entirely disappeared. He missed music. He missed meaning. He missed the version of himself that existed on a stage, behind a microphone, facing the world. And when the itch became unbearable, he scratched. In 1980, he returned to the studio. The result was Double Fantasy, an album recorded with Yoko that was, for many, a surprising shift in tone. Gone were the barbed lyrics, the avant-garde experiments, the undercurrents of rebellion. Instead, Double Fantasy offered something rare in Lennon's catalog: tenderness. Tracks like Beautiful Boy captured a father's love in its purest form, while, just like Starting Over, hinted at renewal not just in marriage, but in selfhood. Critics were cautious. Some called it soft. Others saw it as proof that Lennon had finally evolved beyond his own chaos. But what most agreed on was that the album felt different, clearer, more balanced, like a man who had walked through fire and found, if not peace, then at least purpose. Friends who saw Lennon during this time described him as focused and energized. He had plans for more music, more time with Sean, even a return to live performance. He was reconnecting with his roots, revisiting early rock and roll influences, and perhaps most telling, reaching back toward people he'd once pushed away. Rumors of future collaborations with Paul McCartney were floating in the air. The unthinkable didn't seem so unthinkable anymore. But life, in all its indifference to timing, doesn't always wait for closure. On the evening of December 8th, 1980, Lennon stepped out of the Dakota with Yoko. A fan approached with an album. Lennon signed it. Hours later, the same fan marked David Chapman waited in the shadows with a revolver. As Lennon returned home, Chapman stepped forward and fired 5 shots. For hit their mark. At 11:15 p.m. John Lennon was pronounced dead at Roosevelt Hospital. The world went quiet, then erupted. It was as if an entire generation had lost its voice. News anchors choked back tears. Fans gathered outside the Dakota, singing Imagine through sobs. Tributes poured in from across the globe from artists, leaders, critics, friends. The man who had once joked about being bigger than Jesus was now a martyr of peace, a symbol of senseless violence, a global what-if. But as the world mourned the Lennon they thought they knew, others were left with the more complicated version, the one who hurt as often as he healed, who inspired but also intimidated, who sang about peace while fighting private wars. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people chose to remember the myth. Because myths are easier. They're cleaner, safer, less painful. They don't require reconciliation. They don't ask questions about past behavior or contradictory actions. They let us mourn without guilt. But real legacy lives in the full picture. In Lennon's late in life turn toward fatherhood, we saw a man trying to break a generational chain of abandonment. In Double Fantasy, we heard a man finally understanding softness. And in his very absence, his sudden, violent death, we were reminded of just how fragile transformation can be. It's tempting to end the story here, to say, at least he was on the right path, and leave it at that. But that would be a disservice not just to Lennon, but to everyone who loved him, hated him, was hurt by him, or inspired by him. Because the real lesson isn't that John Lennon changed. It's that he was still changing. And that process, messy, unfinished, interrupted, is what makes his story worth examining, not just idolizing. In the next and final part, we'll return to the question we began with. How do we reconcile greatness with violence, genius with trauma, love with harm? And more importantly, what do we do with that knowledge once the music stops? Because legacies don't just belong to the dead. They belong to us, too. We ended the last section on a sharp, lingering note. John Lennon was still changing. And then, with 4 bullets, the change was cut short. But that leaves us with something much heavier than just grief. It leaves us with the burden of memory, of interpretation, of deciding what we do with the pieces left behind when the music stops, but the consequences echo on. This is where the conversation often gets uncomfortable. Because for every glowing mural of Lennon painted on a city wall, for every tearful cover of Imagine at a vigil, there's someone, perhaps Cynthia, perhaps Julian, perhaps even Bob Wooler, who carries a different version of the man. And both truths exist at the same time. That's the nature of legacy. It's not a trophy you earn. It's a lens we build out of facts, emotions, contradictions, and questions we sometimes don't want answered. And the hardest part of Lennon's legacy is not his death. It's what he left unresolved. Let's begin by acknowledging this. John Lennon was a revolutionary artist. He reshaped modern music. He expanded what it meant to be a songwriter. He took pop and bent it into poetry, pain, satire, politics, and soul. From Help to Working Class Hero, from the anarchy of Revolution to the fragile longing of Jealous Guy. His voice captured the sound of an era coming apart and trying to heal all at once. But we have to resist the urge to let that brilliance eclipse everything else. Because it wasn't just his music that influenced millions, it was his persona, his rebellion, his public stances. He became a shorthand for speaking truth to power, for artistic fearlessness, for transformation. And that's where the weight comes in. Because when someone that influential speaks about peace while acting out violence, we have to ask, what message did we internalize? What contradictions did we normalize? We live in a culture that's both obsessed with redemption and terrible at reckoning. We want our icons to overcome. We want their scars to make their stories richer. But we also want to skip the part where they account for harm. And Lennon's story pushes right up against that blind spot. He was not canceled. He was not crucified by public opinion. In fact, his darker traits were often minimized or reframed as evidence of his tortured genius. Fans didn't turn away when Cynthia shared her story. They didn't abandon him after the Wooler beating. They didn't question the disparity between how he treated Julian and Sean. Instead, they clung harder. Why? Because the myth of the flawed genius is seductive. It lets us love brilliance without responsibility. It gives us permission to ignore red flags when they're attached to a melody we like. It allows the idea of transformation to stand in for accountability. But here's the thing: real transformation requires more than just evolution. It requires recognition, apology, repair. And while Lennon may have taken steps in that direction, especially in his later years, it's fair to ask whether he ever fully completed that process. And that brings us to an even more difficult question. How should we remember someone like John Lennon? Do we honor the art and discard the artist? Do we compartmentalize? Do we create a balance sheet, tallying up the love songs against the violence, the activism against the absences? Maybe those are the wrong questions. Maybe the more honest approach is to embrace complexity, to let both truths breathe in the same space, to admit that a man who wrote "Give Peace a Chance" also hit his wife, that a father who sang "Beautiful Boy" also failed to show up for another son, that a voice that fought for justice also silenced people in his private life. And maybe, instead of protecting the myth, we should examine why we needed it in the first place. Was it because Lennon said what we were afraid to say? Was it because his vulnerability made ours feel less exposed? Was it because we needed Simeone represent both rebellion and hope? These aren't questions with easy answers, and they're not exclusive to Lennon. They apply to every figure we raise to godlike status and then struggle to humanize. Because if we're honest, the story of John Lennon isn't just about John Lennon. It's about us. It's about what we value, what we excuse, what we celebrate. It's about how we process greatness when it doesn't come wrapped in goodness. It's about the way we selectively remember. And maybe, most of all, it's about the way we grieve not just for the people we lose, but for the illusions we have to let go of when the truth becomes undeniable. There's a famous quote that says, "You either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain." Lennon didn't live long enough for either. He died on the verge of reinvention, on the edge of healing, on the cusp of perhaps becoming the man his younger self always needed. And because of that, we're left with a portrait that's always in motion, a life that resists being flattened into legend, a man who was both mirror and mystery, reflecting the best and worst of us, often in the same breath. So what do we do with that? We remember, not selectively, not sentimentally, but completely. We remember the music that changed everything. We remember the pain that shaped him. We remember the wounds he caused and the ones he carried. And we remember, most of all, that no single man, no matter how famous, no matter how brilliant, should be above accountability. Because the point of legacy isn't perfection. It's honesty. And in honoring that, maybe, just maybe, you move closer to the peace Lennon sang about. Not just in song, but in truth. So now that we've peeled back the layers, the genius, the violence, the transformation, and the silence, what are we really left with? A man who stood at the crossroads of brilliance and brutality. A man who helped change the world. yet struggled to change himself. A voice that rallied millions to dream of peace, while his own life often waged war within. Maybe that's the tragedy we're least willing to confront, not the death, not the loss, but the mirror. Because in John Lennon's contradictions, we see our own, our hunger for heroes, our discomfort with their flaws, our impulse to forgive what we don't fully understand, as long as the soundtrack is good enough to hum along to. So here's the question, one we won't answer for you, only leave hanging in the air where it belongs. If we continue to celebrate legends without examining the shadows they cast, are we honoring them? Or are we simply hiding behind them? Thank you for watching this deep dive into a story that refuses to stay simple. If this moved you, challenged you, or made you see things differently, then we did our job. Subscribe to Tragedy Uncovered so you never miss the truths that were buried, the stories that were silenced, and the voices that still need to be heard. See you next time.